Hello and welcome to Optimal, the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Dicken Weatherby, and this podcast and my website all focus on one thing, and that's the quest for optimal health. Our goal is to help you, to help your patients achieve optimal health so they can experience an optimal life. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google, and Spotify. And also make sure to go over to optimaldx.com and check out our resources on the site. Now, without any further delay, is today's episode. Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Dicken Weatherby from Optimal DX. Welcome to Optimal, the podcast. I'm joined, as always, by Beth Ellen DiLuglio in Naples, Florida. Hey, Beth.
Hi. How are you?
I'm a little under the weather. It's my first time I've had a cold, I think, for 2.5 years since COVID happened. And no, it's not COVID. I've done like 900 tests. But anyway, yeah, our weather here in Bend, Oregon has been absolutely crazy. It's mid-May here, and we've already had snow like 5 days ago. We had sub-zero temperatures, not zero Fahrenheit, but sub-below freezing temperatures. It's, yeah, playing havoc with my wife's garden. Anyway, how's life in Naples?
Oh, you don't want to hear. We opened the house up this morning because it was only like 70 degrees.
Okay, enough.
Yeah.
Well, I want your orange juice, so I know. Yeah. So
lemonade. You should make my green lemonade. I put chlorophyll in it and stevia, lemon stevia.
Ooh, maybe we should get that recipe up on the blog. That sounds good.
Yeah. Willard water. Yeah, we'll put it together.
Yeah, along with your chocolicious recipe, which I love. So if you go to the blog at Optimal DX, or we put in some of Beth's very cool little recipes in there. So I love that. Yeah. Anyway, anything new and different in your life since we last talked on the podcast?
Not too much. I mean, I walk, I work, I sleep, I walk, I work, I sleep. That's my life. I'm very content. I keep it really low key and,
cool.
Go out for fresh produce when I have to. So.
Awesome. Well, I'll tell you something that sort of caught my attention over the last few weeks is we just finished HBO's Julia, which is about Julia Childs. I don't know if you've seen that show. And we were watching that and just kind of got really kind of interested in this whole concept of food. And I think Americans have a problem with food. And I think we've made food a bad thing. And I think it really upsets me because I love food. I love eating, and I like, everything in moderation, including moderation itself. But it kind of really got me into thinking about this concept of food as part of community. And having grown up in Europe, in England, and the Sunday lunch was a big deal for us when we were growing up. And, my mom would cook a roast, or we'd go over to someone's house. And it would be really about community breaking of bread. And I know that you as Italian have a concept of that. And the Italians are just like, and the French. So it really got me thinking about how I kind of miss that. I miss the concept of making real food. And we ended up watching the other show called Julia and Julie, which is this woman who writes this blog about, and she cooks every single recipe from Julia Childs' amazing Mastering the Art of French Cooking. Anyway, it just got me thinking about food and kind of feeling a little sad about how we approach food in this country.
I say disordered eating, right? I said eating disorder, but really we have disordered eating. We don't.
Yeah, and it's sort of
meals.
I think the thing about it is cooking real food, like cooking something from scratch. Okay, so maybe some of the stuff that Julia was doing, using 8 sticks of butter, might be a little bit over the top. But if it's just once a week, and you're cooking Boeuf Bourguignon and you put red wine in there, and it becomes that kind of. I mean, in the movie it was, or in the TV show, when she tastes her own food, and that sort of look of sublime bliss came over her face. I think that's so cool. And I've had those experiences. I mean, I love to cook. It's my thing. And, during lockdown, I became like a sourdough baker along with 5 million other people. And I kept a sourdough culture going for over 2 years. And I baked bread every week. And it was just... Huh? No, I didn't. No, I didn't. Bubbly. Because it would bubble. But I love that. And then, I mean, as my wife said, the problem with cooking bread is that you eat it. And, I was eating, maybe because we were isolated, right? I was cooking 2 loaves a week and our freezer started bursting. But anyway, I do miss that. And,
you're lucky because food is not my friend. When you have so many things that that upsets your belly.
Yeah.
The eye tract isn't functioning quite right. It's just a chore. And I understand how you feel because my George, he's a great cook and everything tastes so good and he always goes for the full meals. And I'm just grabbing handfuls. I need 2 handfuls of leafy greens. I'll grab, turkey right out of the container because I have to eat it. I know I need to eat right.
Yeah.
To eat well. And it's not a healthy relationship with food because I'm so mad at food because so many of those types of foods make me sick. But hey, when I like something though, I get what you're saying, man. It's just a full body experience. So I do understand it. And food is your friend.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. That makes me feel very sad.
I was born that way. Believe me, we work things out.
Well, I was also watching last night. I don't know if you know the actor Stanley Tucci.
Oh, in Italy.
Have you been watching his show in Italy? Well, we watched the first one. He goes to Naples and this guy makes a handmade pizza from scratch. And he drives out to the special valley and, where these special tomatoes are grown. And then he goes and gets fresh buffalo mozzarella. And he makes this very simple pizza. And again, that look of just sublime bliss on his face as he takes that first bite. So anyway,
soulful experience.
Got me sort of thinking a little bit. But anyway, today's topic, kind of an extension of maybe not eating very well, is the NMR Lipoprofile. And Beth has been doing some deep dives. I know we always talk about deep dives, but you really have done a deep dive into NMR Lipoprofile. And we've done a blog. We will be doing a blog post on it. But we wanted to kind of do a podcast. I think it's really important because we uncovered a lot of nuances that I think we need to be aware of when we're ordering blood work. And I think the first thing is that Quest, the biggest lab here in the United States, has been kind of gobbling up smaller labs. So one of the labs that they purchased was Cleveland Heart Lab. And Cleveland was doing some pretty progressive testing, one of which was the NMR Lipoprofile. I'm not sure. Are there any other labs that were doing NMR at that point, Beth? I know there's Boston Heart Lab, and I don't even know if they're doing that.
Way back then, I don't know that because I know that LabCorp does now do an NMR.
Yeah, and we were just kind of talking about we know that LabCorp and Quest have different reference ranges for various different biomarkers, and even though they're measuring the same thing, that their ranges are slightly different. But I think that Quest is probably the big player in this whole NMR lipoprofile. So what we wanted to do is kind of go through, talk about what the NMR lipoprofile is, what you can measure in it, why you would measure it. And then we're going to throw a little monkey wrench in here by talking about something called the cardio IQ test, which is also something that Quest puts out. And that is using a methodology called the iron mobility. And Beth will talk a little bit about that. And then we will finish off, or maybe in the middle of this, we will talk about a biomarker that we came across and we were scratching our heads about, which is SD, S as in Sam, D as in dog, LDL. And so we found this molecule called sdLDL, and then we found another one called sdLDL-C. And we were like, are these the same things? So anyway, I'm going to let you kind of talk a little bit about that. But hopefully we're going to dive into NMR lipoprofile stuff, and hopefully this is going to be helpful for you to not only identify what tests to run. We're not going to go over ranges because a lot of the ranges, they do a pretty good job, I think, on Quest, talking about what the goal is, what the moderate risk is, and what the high risk is. So I don't think that we might have different nuances here from sort of this kind of optimal range concept. But in my sense, Beth, is that the reference ranges, they do a pretty good job with those in terms of providing. It's not like you're normal or you're not normal. It's like there is a spectrum. Anything else you want to add before we jump in?
No, I wanted to interject someplace, and I don't know if this will be basic for some folks, but it's a nice reminder. But I like to go with the concept of LDL buses and HDL taxis, just for a little quick overview.
Yeah, I love it.
Right. So the LDL is a lipoprotein, and a big LDL bus can carry and protect a lot of cholesterol, whereas a small little, I call them teen drivers, and lots of little LDL cars can be much more damaging on the road, and they're more apt to crash and they're more apt to get oxidized. So the LDL bus is a big fluffy bus, and the LDL little car is a little teen driver that can wreak havoc.
Right.
And in the HDL taxi, you want a big taxi that can pick up a lot of cholesterol and bring it back to the liver or back to the airport to process it. So that little, think of an LDL as a bus, and you want it big. And the LDL taxi, same thing. You want to have a big taxi to bring a lot of cholesterol back for processing. And
it's a great analogy. Yeah, it's a good way of thinking.
You don't want a lot of little LDLs. They're like those teen drivers that wreak havoc and cause oxidation and accidents and all kinds of things. They get attacked by free radicals and cause damage. So we want a big LDL bus and not a lot of small LDL teen drivers.
Yeah, I mean, I think another way, I mean, I've heard a similar analogy, and it's sort of talking about why the current way that we look at total cholesterol, LDL, and HDL as these sort of major markers that drive treatment decisions by physicians. Oh, your total cholesterol and your LDL are way high. Let's put you on statins. Someone used a more of a military analogy. He said, imagine if you were World War II, you're on the coast of England, and you send a plane up and you see that the armies are invading, and you say to the pilot, I want you to count how many boats are coming over. Mm-hmm. So he comes back and says, there are 13 boats. He says, oh, that's not that many. What he didn't fail to tell you is there are 13 aircraft carriers that have got 10,000 troops in each one. These were tiny little sailboats. So really, just knowing the number of these things is really not that helpful. So the purpose behind what we're talking about today is, yes, I think every panel that you're running has these biomarkers that are total cholesterol, HDL, LDL. Now we've got the LDL-HDL ratios. We've got the cholesterol-HDL ratios. We've got triglyceride. So there's a little nuances that we can do. But this is kind of diving deeper. So let's kick off here with, what does NMR stand for? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance. And it's a method in this case. It's actually what they're doing is trying to take a closer look at the lipoproteins that are present and the lipoproteins that carry cholesterol, triglycerides, antioxidants, and even other things. So we're not just, like you said, what is the number of the LDL in the blood? That's not what we're looking at, of the LDL cholesterol. We're actually diving a little deeper to see what the size of the LDL particle is. What is it carrying? Mm-hmm. So with this method, this NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, it's literally a lab method, but they want to go further in to find out the size, the density, and the particle number of the different lipoprotein classes. So they're still going to look at VLDL, LDL, and even intermediate density lipoprotein and HDL. But within those classes, they can tell us the size and the number, and then what does that mean? If I can jump right in now, if you want me to.
Well, let's kind of like take this taxi analogy or the bus analogy that you were talking about, right? So we're looking at size. So this LDL, VLDL, IDL, and HDL molecule, what is its size? Is it big? Is it intermediate? Or is it small? And then looking at what its density is, how densely packed that particular molecule is. So again, our military concept is, you've got a boat that could carry 10 people, but it's actually packed with 25 people. That's a fairly densely packed boat. Mm-hmm. And then also the particle numbers, how many actual particles are carried in that? That's like that concept of like, oh, there's 13 boats. Well, actually, it's 13 aircraft carriers that can carry 10,000 troops. So it really is giving you that sort of quantitative measurement. I think that's super important. So now let's go into the subclasses, because I think, to bear with us while we kind of go through a lot of anachronisms, but I think this is very important to get a sense of density, particle size, particle numbers in terms of these various different subclasses.
Okay. All right. So first, they do to start with the VLDL. So that's a very low density lipoprotein. And for VLDL, you want smaller VLDLs.
Right.
Because the larger VLDLs, in this particular test, they classify it as VLDL1. But VLDL1 is larger, it's higher in triglycerides. It's the VLDL that gets converted to the small, dense lipoprotein LDL, which
we'll talk about later.
At sdLDL. Yeah. And the larger VLDLs are associated with insulin resistance. Mm-hmm. So you want the big guys for the VLDL happen to be the bad guys. And then you want the smaller VLDL, that's VLDL2. So that's a smaller VLDL, and it's actually lower in triglycerides.
Okay, interesting.
So VLDL, we want smaller VLDLs.
So that's interesting. So VLDL as a particle or as a molecule carries a lot of triglycerides. So obviously you don't want to have a lot of triglycerides moving around your blood on that respect. Mm-hmm. All right. So then we've got low density lipoproteins, in which there are 4 subclasses. So we have that, again, they're classified as VLDL1, VLDL2,
LDL.
And now we're in LDL, LDL1, 2, 3, and 4. So LDL1 are what they call large buoyant particles. LDL2 is their intermediate. And then we have this classification of this thing that we said that we'd talk about, which is sdLDL. So talk a little bit about LDL3 and LDL4. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, LDL-3 and LDL-4 are both small, dense particles, right? Again, we're not even talking about the cholesterol content. And that's where I think people get somewhat confused because the sdLDL cholesterol content is another thing. Right now, we're talking about the actual particle, the carrier. So the small, dense LDL particle is 18 to 20.5 nanometers, and it's part of what they call the pattern B phenotype, and that's the bad guy. So LDL 1 and 2, they both reflect pattern A phenotype, and that's the good one. And the small, dense particles represent pattern B phenotype, the bad guy. So these small, dense, it's interesting because the small, dense LDL particles carry more triglycerides, but they carry less cholesterol. They also carry or contain fewer antioxidant nutrients, which is so important because really the bottom line when we're talking about atherosclerosis, which is really what we're always talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's an oxidative process. It's the oxidized LDL that ends up being a problem that can set off atherosclerosis. So these small, dense LDL particles, they're more apt to get oxidized, partly because they have fewer antioxidant nutrients on them or in them. So they're prone to oxidation. They're also more prone to glycation, and they have a longer circulation time. So there's more time for them to wreak havoc, right? It's like these teen drivers who are out after midnight. They're wreaking havoc. You know they're going to be trouble, right? Even if they haven't started trouble yet, they have a potential. So we don't want a lot of small, dense teen drivers on the road after midnight. So they tend to stick around longer in circulation, and that's a problem. And then the same thing, the LDL-4, too, also a version of the small, dense LDL particle. So we want, in this case, the larger LDLs, and those are the ones I call the buses, and not the small, dense LDLs, because they contained teenage punks who are going to have to stay out after midnight and cause trouble.
Right. Okay. Now about our taxis, our HDL molecules, because the NMR also gives us quite a bit of information about HDL, high-density lipoproteins. And I think, again, you're talking about how a larger HDL particle size. So when we look at particle size in the NMR lipoprofile results, they'll give you a quantitative sense of is it nanometers. So you want large particle sizes. So it's associated with lower cardiovascular risk, while we have a smaller particle size is associated with an increased cardiovascular risk. And then
not all HDL is good. You know, we always thought, HDL is one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Peter Attia, I know I've talked about him on this podcast before. He's a medical doctor. If you really want to dive deep into this stuff, go over to Peter Attia's website. Anyway, he just released an email today talking about this type of stuff and why medical science and physicians are doing us a major disservice by talking about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. Because, as you said, if you have small, dense HDL particles, that's an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So you could have an HDL of 75, but it's full of small HDL particles that are not serving any purpose for us at all.
I think the oxidation, too, I love to really remind people, right, that the small, dense LDLs, the sdLDLs, can get oxidized, and that's really the trigger for atherosclerosis. And I always say, well, what's the opposite of oxidation? Antioxidants. To me, it always boils down to nutrition, as you know. So we get all this minutia. Sometimes we can't see the forest for the trees. And I still say that the bottom line is there's going to be a lack of dietary antioxidants and, of course, endogenous antioxidants that contribute to cardiovascular disease. And now we know with this clue about the sdLDL, if they're around, they're apt to get oxidized and really wreak havoc. So again, it comes back to antioxidants are so important in this process.
Yeah. Another question could be, where do we purchase this for our patients? Quest obviously is the main provider, but as Beth mentioned, LabCorp also does the NMR lipoprotein. Funnily enough, Ultra Lab Tests, which is a wholesaler for Quest, they don't have this on their menu, and I'm not sure why, but they have this other one called the Cardio IQ, which we'll get to later. And then I think you also said that Direct Labs doesn't have the NMR lipoprotein subfraction.
The NMR, I did. I called, I chatted.
Yeah.
That's too bad. So they do the ion mobility instead, which is kind of interesting because from what I can dig up, it's the only FDA approved test is the NMR. And then the Cardio IQ still even says this is not an FDA approved test. So maybe it'll get FDA approval, I'm not sure, but the NMR seems to be the tried and true so far. but the iron mobility maybe is coming up on the outside like Rich Strike, Or on the inside, like
Using a Kentucky Derby analogy, right?
that's all I am.
Did you put any money on it?
No.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, it would be awesome.
Avexia is a LabCorp provider, so I know that they would have LabCorp's NMR lipoprotein. Also, just sort of the nomenclature that they come up with. I mean, NMR lipoprotein subfractionation. I know there's other terms that are thrown out, but ultimately, I think the bottom line is it goes way beyond total cholesterol testing, which is really unable to identify the majority of individuals who are developing cardiovascular disease. It's funny, I have a new GP that I went to, I think it was in early January, and I didn't tell him the work that I do, and I didn't tell him my background, and I was just really curious just to talk to him. And he's been a 20-year GP, and so we were talking about blood testing, and I said, what type of blood testing would you routinely do on someone in their early 50s? And I don't have any familial history of diabetes or cardiovascular disease. I mean, my blood pressure is really good. I'm in good health. I'm a little overweight. That's okay. So he said, well, we'll just do a CMP, we'll do a CBC. And I said, would you do any, cholesterol testing? He said, yeah, we just do the standard cholesterol testing for you. He didn't even say standard. He said, yeah, we'll run cholesterol tests. I said, out of curiosity, for someone my age, do you think it would be important to do kind of some sex hormones? He goes, why would we want to do that? So I kind of left it. And then I said, well, what about doing some like deeper diving into cholesterol? I mean, do you ever do like lipoprotein subfractions? And he looked at me, he was like, how do you know about that? And basically he said, no. And I said, well, why not? He said, it's not going to change the way I treat. I said, how do you treat? He said, I would use statin. I was like, oh my God, this is the problem with modern medicine. And 5 minutes later, he kicked me out after 5 minutes, right? So
the only have to do is Google you. If he Googled you, he'd have known who he had.
Well, maybe not. I don't know. But anyway, so basically, I think the point being is, yes, we measure total cholesterol, something that we report on in the software. We have a lipid reporting that we do. And I think that the point being is, if some of those scoring that we do, which sort of risk scoring, goes really high, I think this is an opportunity then to kind of go into this deeper understanding of, we're not even talking about LP(a) or ApoA and ApoB and the ratios between those. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, go over to the blog. We've got some good articles on that. We're really talking about this NMR stuff. So really this subfractionation is really far superior than measuring or calculating the amount of cholesterol carried by LDL or HDL. It gives us a breakdown, like we said, of this particle size. So it's a really, really good test to run, and especially for anyone that is considered at high risk. And I would almost say it's cheap enough now. We were just looking at some of the pricing on some of the websites. Like for out of pocket for $150, wouldn't you want to know kind of this type of information, even just to get a baseline? So anyone in their mid-40s or above. Anyway, I think it's a great little test.
And that's the direct access. And unfortunately, and I am from Rhode Island, they still don't allow direct access testing, unfortunately.
In Rhode Island?
So, yeah, New York. New York is.
Yeah, New York is one of the worst. Yeah, one of the worst.
Yeah, it's too bad though, because then the doctors probably won't order it. They don't know if it's going to get covered by insurance, and it can be expensive if they actually charge you directly. But most states, you can do this direct access testing, and I think it's well worth it. I always paid for my own blood work out of pocket.
Right.
With a full panel.
As practitioners, we can get really good pricing. I mean, if it's from Avexia or Alta or Direct Labs or any of these other companies, Life Extensions as well. Yeah, pretty cool. So let's talk a little bit about small, dense LDL particles. This is something that is measured called sdLDL, especially used for uncovering coronary artery disease. We kind of came across this other molecule called sdLDL-C. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the difference between those two particular molecules.
Yeah, I mean, even the measurement is different. So you couldn't, if you're going to try to plug some results into the software, and we have a place for sdLDL, that's the lipoprotein itself. We're going to have a separate place for the sdLDL-C, which is the amount of cholesterol that's carried on the sdLDL.
Yeah.
And now it's like less than 50 is desirable. So when we put it in as a biomarker in the software, we'll have the ranges, and if we have an optimal range that's different than standard, it'll be there. But that's actually the amount of cholesterol carried by the sdLDL. And if you remember from before, it's strange because the sdLDL carries really more triglyceride than cholesterol. So it's like the cholesterol is not the main player anymore, even if you're measuring the sdLDL-C. So I think the thing to remember is, though, especially if a practitioner is using the software, is making sure that you're either going to be putting in the number of sdLDL particles in one place and the amount of sdLDL cholesterol in a second place. So they are two different things, right? Two separate entities, really, two separate entries. And again, to remember, because native LDL or cholesterol itself, right? There's only one molecule of cholesterol. It always bothers me when they say good and bad. Like this cholesterol, it just takes either the bus or the taxi, right?
Right, right.
And the taxi is scavenging it and bringing it back for processing. So just to say that the LDL cholesterol is bad or what have you, it just bothers the heck out of me. So sorry,
Yeah.
it's always a little soapbox that I jump up on. But so the sdLDL, again, is the one that's prone to oxidation. Good old LDL cholesterol, a cholesterol that's getting dropped off by the LDL bus. It's good cholesterol. It's a cholesterol that's going to be used in the body. It's good, healthy cholesterol. It's when it gets oxidized that really seems to be the problem. I really like to drive that home with people. In this way, doing the NMR, the lipoprotein subfractionation, is a way to find out if you have a lot of those little sdLDLs. Those are the bad guys. And they're prone to oxidation. So the thing to do is to up your antioxidant, what you consume, but also what you make in your own body. So, and I have to say, I did come across information that, interestingly enough, the statins do, for some reason, statins also act as antioxidants. And the statins might actually lower the sdLDL level. So they might work, but why not do it naturally in a way that your body needs anyway, with healthy food and plenty of antioxidants and precursors to your own endogenous antioxidants? To me, that should always be the first route. And if you do have familial hyperlipidemia and you do have to have a medication, that's really what the statins were meant for people that just didn't have that feedback loop that would stop the HMG co-reductase enzyme from producing more cholesterol. You just inhibit that with a statin if you have that genetic issue where your own feedback loops aren't working. But I did find that the statins might lower that SDL.
That's interesting.
Level.
Yeah.
I'd just rather do it naturally.
Yeah.
Statins, obviously, we know can have some serious side effects, and for some people can be deadly. And there is a set of people that cannot take statins. It would be fatal for them.
So a good thing to ask ourselves is, like, when would you want to run NMR lipoprofile? You spoke a very important one. If there's a familial history of hyperlipidemia, you know that you have a parent that has died of cardiovascular disease, it's a no-brainer. You've got to get this done. Also, if there is an established cardiovascular disease, for monitoring and making sure that treatment, be it natural or if you're taking statins, that it's working for you. I think the other one, too, is something that you mentioned, which is insulin resistance, and that's obviously tied. We now know that diabetes is so closely tied in with cardiovascular disease. It's almost like a triad together. But anyone on that sort of pre-diabetic road or the road to diabetes should definitely be getting this. Anyone with hypertension, I think, too, because that puts you at a higher risk for having a stroke or an myocardial infarction. And then metabolic syndrome. And these are all things that we do report on in the software. And the things that we report on in the software are trending towards. So we don't want to wait until you've got metabolic syndrome or wait until you've got established cardiovascular disease or wait until you've got diabetes, which is oftentimes the approach of medical doctors because they don't have a way to deal with this before it's happening. So
someone's heading for the cliff, right? If somebody's running towards the cliff.
Yeah, what would you do? You would like shout at them and you would try and stop them from running off, rather than like as they're flying off the cliff, giving them a potentially leaky parachute.
Parachute,
yeah. Anyone that's got, I would say, probably an LDL, classic LDL, that's maybe over, 200 or something, I think will probably be a good marker. Or if they've got these other traditional cardiovascular risks, and one of the things I do go over in my training program is, I think, sort of the 16 independent risk factors for cardiovascular disease, because it's not just cholesterol. It's a lot of other biomarkers that can give us really, really good information. Homocysteine, fibrinogen, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, vitamin D, testosterone, iron levels too can be a contributing factor. So these would all be reasons to actually run this test in the first place. Like we said, commercial labs such as Quest Diagnostics, they have the Cleveland Heart Lab is a lab that they purchased, and whether they're actually merging that test into being a Quest test or whether they're keeping the branding as Cleveland, I'm not sure. LabCorp does the lipoprofile. Both of these companies, Quest and LabCorp, they are offering what is known as the NMR lipoprotein subfractionation, as do some of the direct access lab services that we could potentially use with our clients. Not all. As we mentioned, Ultra Lab Tests does not, and Direct Labs does not. And I think Avexia, because they're a LabCorp provider, do. I wanted to finish off here with just some very quick interpretive stuff and then we'll jump into the cardio ion or the cardio IQ as sort of the difference between the two. So I'm going to use the word bad and good because I think in this situation it probably is classified that way. So high numbers of these on an NMR lipoprofile are bad. LDL particle number, if you have high LDL particle numbers, not good. If you have a lot of LDL small particles, not good. You have a lot of medium-sized particles of LDL, probably not very good. If you have a low level of HDL large-sized particles, as Beth mentioned, we want big taxis, we want big buses. So large HDL is large taxis. If you have a low number of high-density lipoprotein large-sized particles, not good. So conversely, the presence of large HDL particles is good, right? So that would be green. High LDL particle numbers, high small particles of LDL and high medium particles of LDL would be red, not so good. Anything else you want to mention about the interpretation?
Well, that's just, again, just kind of simplify it. Large LDL good, large HDL good, large VLDL bad.
Yeah. It's just another way of looking at it, right? So I'm focusing on the bad and good, and you're like, just let's look at it from the other perspective. Yeah,
I know.
My glass is half empty, yours is glass is half full. So,
you know what, too, and I stress for people to really go back and read the original report that you get to, and because there could be nuances, and to familiarize yourself instead of just entering things into the software. Once we have this all set for the software, you have to know if you've ordered your NMR or if you've ordered an ion mobility.
Yeah, so we will actually probably create individual biomarkers that will have NMR. So it'll say LDL particle number parentheses NMR. So it's like really easy to know.
Idea.
Yeah. So we'll get those in. I'm hoping in the next few weeks. So yeah, super stoked to get those in. All right, let's finish off here. The question that we could answer is NMR the same as ion mobility or other methods of lipoprotein fractionations, for instance, the cardio IQ test? And the answer is no. So do you want to run into why that's not the same?
Hey, again, technical laboratory. Really.
You're going to talk about ultracentrifugation, gradient cell electrophoresis.
All those different ones, I know. But there are older tests like the GGE. There's so much that we could have covered. But yeah, it seems like the most popular now, the NMR, the ion mobility, the different I'm going to say lab techniques is the best way to say that. But they also use different ways of measuring. So you can't exchange one for another. Right. You can't take your ion mobility results and plug them into the NMR biomarker section. You have to make sure that they're different. They're apples and oranges, basically. Yeah. Remember to treat them that way. And again, it's a little more lab technique that I'm not familiar with the details. I suppose somebody could go over those, but it all is really how they're going to figure out how to assess these lipoprotein sizes and particles. But it does say the NMR is like less labor intensive, so less expensive, I guess. So they did say, and again, it's the only one that's FDA approved from what I can tell up to now. But it seems to be an easier test to actually do. It's not as labor intensive. And
also the kind of like the subfractions that they give you, they're a lot less. I think that it boils down to just 4 things, really. LDL particle number, LDL small, LDL medium, HDL large, and then this LDL peak size, which is actually a measurement that and that's not done in meters, it's done in angstroms, which is another unit. So, and kind of when I look at the actual report itself, you're going to get your standard lipid panel, cholesterol total, HDL, triglycerides, LDL, cholesterol, HDL, cholesterol ratio, non-HDL cholesterol, and then it's going to give you these lipoprotein subfractions. So that's an interesting kind of nuance there. So it's not a lipoprotein. Well, what do they call it in NMR? I guess it's a subfraction, isn't it? So
subfractionation.
Yeah, subfractionation.
It's weird because I found an older, it seemed like it was cardio IQ results, and they had a lot more information. So maybe they just boiled it down to put it into this smaller panel for the cardio IQ itself.
Yeah.
Including everything, right? HSCRP is even in there.
Yes. So they're adding the apolipoproteins, apolipoprotein B, which is, you want that one to be low. And then lipoprotein little a, again, you want that to be low. So those are the two more atherogenic apolipoproteins. And then they give you some inflammatory markers, HSCRP, and then LPPLA2 activity, which you just wrote a couple of really good short research-based articles in the blog on those two, LPPLA2 and then LPPLA2 activity. So yeah, in some ways, it might be, the cardio IQ might be kind of like your first pass test for this. But like we said earlier, it's like the NMR Lipoprofile, it sounds like it's getting to be very reasonable. I mean, I think $148 was what we saw for very basic. So why not get this NMR Lipoprofile done on your patients and really help them kind of understand what their risk is? And like you said, there's lots and lots that we can do from a sort of alternative natural functional medicine perspective and nutritional to deal with a lot of these issues rather than just resorting to drugs.
If people adopt these habits too over time, they won't be going to the physician with all these problems, because I think a lot of them will be resolved.
Yeah. Anyway, well, that's our podcast for the month. So NMR Lipoprofile, I hope you found this to be helpful. Again, Quest and LabCorp both run these tests. I think we gave some really good information about when you might want to run this. And each of the reports themselves, I think they do a really good job in terms of showing the ranges and also the relative risk for the results. So in the software, we'll obviously be building this in here, but I think Beth, absolutely, you're right. And I think this is also true for any blood test that you're doing. Don't just rely on shoving a whole numbers into the software. It's going to give you some really, really, really good information, don't get me wrong. But always go back to that original report, because even a legal perspective, that is the document of record for the blood test that you have run. What you're doing in the software is an add-on. This is a value add that you're providing, but ultimately you do need to share that original report with them. And they often have some really interesting and good information on them. So that's pretty cool. Anything else you want to say about this, Beth, before we wind up?
Well, it'll be in a blog, right? It'll be posted as a blog. If people want to actually look and read through what we just talked about, that'll be posted, the subfractionation. And no, just remember, eat your fruits and vegetables.
Eat your fruits and vegetables. So one of the things, I'm going to get a little insight here, and we're not ready to publish or put this up on the website yet, but we're doing a really, again, I'll use the word deep dive, we're doing a dive into every biomarker that we have in the software. You know, one of the things that we're wanting to really at Optimal DX is to become sort of this point of reference for the work that we're doing. And Beth and I are going through every biomarker, and we're looking at research. There is a ton of research, isn't there, about biomarker ranges. So, you know, we get these comments from medical doctors, oh, you know, what you're doing is complete nonsense. There's no such thing as an optimal range. It's like, no, there is, and we should be paying attention to it. I often say, so if that's the case, then where the heck are these standard ranges coming from? Because to have a BUN, for instance, have a completely different reference range just because your blood is run by Quest as opposed to LabCorp, and you happen to live in this, it's ridiculous.
Different part of the country.
Different part of the country, different part of the world. I actually look at reference lookup tables in our software because we want to provide the standard ranges that are appearing on your blood test. They're very different. And sometimes it's just a matter of one number. So like it might be the BUN is top is 22 for Quest, but it's 23 for LabCorp. It's like, come on, you know, can we just, what is the other thing that we were talking about the other day that we were just like scratching our heads? We were like, can't you just like come up with just one way of doing this as opposed to like 19? It's frustrating, but anyway, that's just
what we're doing.
That's what we're doing. Yeah, we're doing it for you. So if you go over to the blog, if you go to the website, optimaldx.com, we have a resources link at the top on the horizontal navigation. If you click that and scroll down, we have our ODX research, optimal research blog. And this is where we post kind of in-depth research-based articles on topics that we cover in podcasts that we've done in the past. Like we did one on insulin resistance, menopause, and andropause, and we've done white papers on these, but also just short blog posts around these biomarkers. And this is becoming kind of the point of reference for, I think we've covered all of the blood glucose. It's not just blood glucose. It's like there's 15 or 12 different biomarkers that we're looking at. Beth has done the research for us. She's got the research there. We quantify or qualify everything that's being said in those blog posts to research. So I'm really excited about this project. I'm hoping that we'll be finished, that we can actually put up a web page which will give you everything that you need as a practitioner to substantiate the work that you're doing here with us at Optimal DX. So first of all, I'm super, super grateful for you, Beth, for taking that on. You provide a great, great service for not only Optimal DX, but all of our users as well. So subscribe to our blogs. Every Monday, you'll get an email with you can look through that and go, wow, I didn't realize that adiponectin was in the software. And you can go over and you can read a little deep dive into adiponectin. What does it mean when it's high? What does it mean when it's low? What is the overview? What are the optimal takeaways? And then those research points as well. So thank you, Beth, very much for all that you do for Optimal DX. My name is Dr. Dicken Weatherby. I'm the CEO of Optimal DX. If you're interested in what we're doing, we're all about helping you and your patients live an optimal life through optimal testing and optimal ranges, and really giving your patients an idea of what their health journey is. And so that you can kind of create a treatment plan and make course corrections as needed. So come over to Optimal DX. We're here for you. Thanks for listening. Really appreciate your time. All right, Beth. See you later.
Thanks. Bye-bye.